The morning of April 14th, 1943, broke over Fleet Radio Unit Pacific at Pearl Harbor with the quiet urgency that only a breakthrough intelligence moment could bring. Pencils moved across paper in steady rhythm as cryptographers bent over their desks, systematically converting intercepted Japanese naval characters into crisp English text. The message streaming across the paper originated from the office of the Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, and as word after word revealed itself, the officers in the room began to grasp what they were looking at: an inspection tour schedule. For Admiral Yamamoto himself, the itinerary was staggeringly specific. Departure from Rabaul at precisely 0600 hours Tokyo time, April 18. Arrival at Balalay Airfield at 0800 hours Tokyo time. Transport via 2 Type 1 medium bombers protected by an escort of 6 Type 0 fighters. Every detail was there, laid bare in the intercepted cipher. The exact times, the specific aircraft types, the precise routes. Technical Sergeant Harold Fudina, a Nisei translator working with the Military Intelligence Service, methodically cross-checked his translation against the original cipher text, his eyes tracing each character with the intensity of someone who understood exactly what he was reading. The Japanese military never left things to chance, and this message proved it. Extraordinary detail embedded in every line, exact times specified, specific aircraft called out, routes precisely charted. Within minutes, the decoded intelligence was delivered to Commander William Goggins, who directed Fleet Radio Unit Pacific operations. Goggins absorbed the information in an instant and recognized immediately what everyone in that room was beginning to understand. The significance of this message could reshape the war itself. Commander Edwin Layton, Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, received the decoded material within minutes. His eyes widened as the full weight of what he was reading crashed over him. Admiral Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, the man who had orchestrated that devastating blow against the American fleet, would be traveling through airspace where American fighters could potentially intercept him. He would be vulnerable. There would be exactly one opportunity. What none of them could have known at that moment was that this single decoded message was about to set in motion the most audacious fighter interception in the entire history of aviation. The Pacific War had taught American military commanders a harsh but vital lesson. Individual Japanese commanders were never simply military leaders. They were symbols that unified entire fleets, that inspired pilots across hundreds of miles of ocean, that embodied the enemy's fighting spirit. Kill the symbol, conventional military thinking suggested, and you shatter morale across an entire naval force. Yamamoto represented far more than naval command authority. He was Harvard-educated, widely traveled, a man who understood poker and understood America in ways that few Japanese military officers did. He had hitchhiked across America, walked through automobile factories in Detroit, studied oil refineries in Texas, examined aircraft manufacturing plants in California. He understood American industrial capacity in a way that other Japanese commanders simply did not. His warnings about that capacity had been dismissed. His reluctance to wage war against the United States had been overruled by his political superiors. But once the commitment to war had been made, Yamamoto had demonstrated his brilliant strategic mind. He orchestrated Pearl Harbor with mathematical precision, achieved tactical victories throughout the early Pacific campaigns, nearly delivered decisive triumph at Midway before American codebreakers managed to turn the tide of the battle itself. The Lockheed P-38G Lightning sat on the tarmac at Fighter Strip No. 2 on Henderson Field at Guadalcanal, gleaming in the Pacific sun. Twin Allison, Phi-1710, 8991 engines gave the aircraft tremendous power, capable of pushing it to 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The distinctive twin booms stretched behind the engines, connected by a horizontal stabilizer spanning 52 feet, giving the aircraft its unmistakable silhouette. The central nacelle housed the pilot and the formidable armament package: 4 Browning ANM 250 caliber machine guns and 1 Hispano M20 20mm cannon clustered in the nose, an arrangement that eliminated the convergence problems that plagued wing-mounted weapons on other fighters. With two external 165-gallon drop tanks supplementing the 300 gallons of internal fuel capacity, the Lightning could achieve a combat radius exceeding 450 miles. No other American fighter operating anywhere in the Pacific Theater possessed that kind of range. Major John William Mitchell stood in the operations dugout, studying weather reports and intelligence updates with the concentrated focus of a chess master analyzing a crucial game. Commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, 347th Fighter Group, Mitchell had logged more than 2,000 flight hours in everything from basic trainers to the latest pursuit aircraft. His mind processed the tactical problem before him with the precision of a navigational computer grinding through calculations. The distance from Guadalcanal to the calculated intercept point measured 435 miles in a direct line. But direct flight would carry them directly over Japanese-held islands, bristling with radar installations and Coast Watcher observer posts positioned to provide early warning. The indirect route, swinging far out over the open sea before turning north toward the target, added 165 miles to the distance. Total outbound distance would be 600 miles. Return distance another 400 miles. The total mission distance came to 1,000 miles, with fuel reserves remaining for perhaps 7 minutes of maximum power combat. The mathematics were ruthless and unforgiving. Mitchell knew the numbers by heart. Standard P-38G internal fuel capacity totaled 300 gallons in main tanks and 60 gallons in reserve. Adding the two 165-gallon drop tanks provided an additional 330 gallons. Total available fuel reached 690 gallons maximum. Consumption at cruise settings ran approximately 50 gallons per hour per engine at low altitude, increasing substantially with altitude and aggressive power settings. Flying time available under ideal conditions stretched just over 5 hours and 45 minutes. Required flying time for the mission, accounting for navigation, potential delays, and the need to reach attack altitude, totaled a minimum of 4 hours and 30 minutes. The margin for error was essentially zero when accounting for combat maneuvering, unexpected headwinds, or any deviation from the planned course. Captain Thomas George Lanthier, Jr. had committed every detail of the mission profile to memory through relentless study, burning each element into his consciousness. Son of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lanthier, Sr., a decorated World War I aviator who had served on General Billy Mitchell's staff, the younger Lanthier carried both the tactical skills and the political instincts that would shape an extraordinary future. Standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and the confident bearing of someone born to leadership, he had already claimed 5 aerial victories, though whispers within the squadron suggested that some of those victories remained disputed. His aggressive flying style and his talent for self-promotion had earned him devoted admirers within the squadron, but also quiet detractors who questioned his methods. At 27 years old, Lanthier viewed the Yamamoto mission as his pathway to fame and the post-war political success that increasingly occupied his thinking. First Lieutenant Rex Theodore Barber embodied a different archetype of American fighter pilot. An Oregon farm boy from Culver who had attended Oregon State College studying engineering before enlisting in September 1940, Barber flew with mechanical precision and quiet competence. Where Lanthier pursued glory through spectacular flying, Barber pursued efficiency through careful calculation. His confirmed aerial victories had been earned through methodical positioning and accurate gunnery, rather than spectacular aerobatics. At 25 years old, he had developed the capacity to visualize three-dimensional combat geometry with remarkable clarity. His methodical approach to aerial combat reflected his engineering training. Every action calculated, every risk carefully assessed, every burst of gunfire carefully aimed before commitment. Aboard Mitsubishi G4ME-1 Type 1 bomber No. 323 at Lakunai Airfield in Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto reviewed the inspection schedule with his assembled staff. The Betty bomber, as American pilots called it, represented both Japanese ingenuity and the compromises that came with pushing aircraft design to its limits. Exceptional range of 2,150 miles had been achieved through minimal armor protection and the critical omission of self-sealing fuel tanks. Maximum speed reached 265 miles per hour at 19,785 feet, with cruise speed around 200 miles per hour. The aircraft's dangerous vulnerability had earned it a grim nickname among Japanese aircrew, Hamaki or cigar, a reference to its tendency to burst into flames catastrophically when struck by gunfire. For this particular mission, 6 A6M3 Model 32-0 fighters from the 204th Air Group would provide protective escort. Yamamoto, at 59 years old, remained Japan's most formidable strategic thinker despite his age. Born Isoroku Takano and later adopted into the Yamamoto family, he stood 5 feet 3 inches tall, yet he carried himself with the dignity expected of samurai descent. His left hand bore the marks of combat from the Battle of Tsushima Strait on May 27, 1905. The index and middle fingers lost to Russian shrapnel when a gun turret exploded aboard the armored cruiser Nishin. The injury had never diminished his passion for calligraphy, his skill at poker, or his capacity to command respect through pure force of personality. During his time at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, he had hitchhiked across America, observing automobile factories in Detroit, refineries in Texas, aircraft manufacturing plants in California. That experience had convinced him with absolute certainty that war against America was ultimately unwinnable, a conviction he had expressed in his famous quote about running wild for 6 months before inevitable defeat. The American plan depended entirely on maintaining absolute secrecy regarding signals intelligence capabilities. If Japanese Naval Command even suspected their codes were compromised, they would immediately cancel Yamamoto's flight or alter the schedule. The cryptanalysis team at Station Hypo, recently redesignated as Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, had been systematically breaking JN-25 variants since before the Battle of Midway. Their capacity to read Japanese naval traffic had grown increasingly sophisticated over time, progressing from partial decrypts to nearly complete message recovery. But every decoded message carried risk. Each successful decrypt threatened to reveal American capabilities if the Japanese analyzed their own security procedures carefully. The decision to act on the Yamamoto intercept required approval from Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the South Pacific area, Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell, commanding Air Solomons, and ultimately President Franklin Roosevelt himself. Roosevelt allegedly gave the simple order, "Get Yamamoto." The interception planning fell to multiple officers working in close coordination. Marine Major John Condon, operations officer for Commander Aircraft Solomons, created the initial flight plan, calculating fuel consumption and navigation waypoints with methodical precision. Mitchell reviewed Condon's plan and found the airspeeds and timing estimates unsuitable for actual P-38 performance characteristics. Mitchell recalculated everything from the beginning, working with his pilots through the night, developing a plan that maximized their chances of success while minimizing detection risk. The final route consisted of 5 precisely calculated legs, each designed to thread through gaps in Japanese radar coverage while accounting for wind drift and magnetic deviation. Intelligence analysis suggested multiple factors favoring the mission's success. The date, April 18th, marked exactly 1 year since the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, providing powerful symbolic significance. Weather forecasts indicated favorable conditions, with scattered clouds and good visibility expected. Most critically, radio traffic analysis showed no indication that Japanese commanders suspected their codes had been compromised. Normal operational patterns continued with no evidence of increased security measures or defensive preparations. If surprise could be achieved, it would be complete. The Zero escort presented a formidable challenge that consumed much of the mission planning discussions. The Mitsubishi A6M3 Model 32 and 0 possessed superior maneuverability to the P-38 at medium and low altitudes. Maximum speed reached 336 miles per hour at 19,685 feet, climb rate 3,100 feet per minute, with the capacity to turn inside virtually any American fighter, achieving turning radii smaller than 1,000 feet. But these exceptional capabilities came through radical weight reduction, empty weight of only 3,980 pounds compared to the P-38's 12,180 pounds. The pilot received armor protection consisting of nothing more than a single 55mm thick piece of bulletproof glass. No self-sealing fuel tanks protected the airframe. Structural strength had been calculated to absolute minimum requirements. In a turning dogfight below 20,000 feet, a Zero would destroy a P-38. But in a high-speed diving attack, utilizing superior firepower and structural strength, the Lightning held decisive advantages. Lieutenant Besby Frank Holmes had analyzed Zero combat tactics throughout his tour in the Solomon Islands. Japanese pilots typically maintained close escort formation, positioning themselves 1,000 to 1,500 feet above and slightly behind the bombers in 2-3-plane Vic formations. Standard doctrine called for the escorts to immediately engage any attacking fighters, while the bombers continued toward their destination, relying on speed and defensive armament for protection. But American intelligence had identified a pattern. When surprised by attacks from unexpected angles, particularly from below and behind, Japanese formations often reacted slowly, as if the pilots needed precious seconds to process what was happening. The key would be achieving complete tactical surprise despite approaching across 600 miles of open ocean in daylight. April 17, 1943, the mission briefing began at 2000 hours in the Pacific Operations Tent. Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell, Commander Air Solomons, personally addressed the assembled pilots. Known for his advocacy of naval aviation and his command of USS Hornet during the Doolittle raid exactly 1 year earlier, Mitchell understood precisely what this mission meant. 18 P-38s would participate in the operation. 4 aircraft, designated as the killer flight, would attack the bombers directly. 12 aircraft would provide top cover against the anticipated response from Kahili Airfield's defending fighters. 2 additional aircraft would serve as spares in case of mechanical failures. The pilots selected for the killer flight included Captain Lanthier, Lieutenant Barber, Lieutenant Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond Hine. Spare pilots selected were Lieutenant James McClanahan and Joe Moore. Mitchell's navigation plan reflected both brilliance and necessity, born from extensive overwater navigation experience. Leg 1 called for magnetic heading 265 degrees for 55 minutes at 30 to 50 feet altitude, covering 183 miles. Leg 2, heading 290 degrees for 27 minutes, covering 89 miles. Leg 3, heading 305 degrees for 38 minutes, covering 125 miles. Leg 4, heading 330 degrees for 16 minutes, covering 52 miles. Leg 5, heading 290 degrees for 21 minutes, covering 70 miles, while climbing to attack altitude. Each leg had been calculated to avoid Japanese observation posts on New Georgia, Vella La Vella, and the Treasury Islands, while compensating for forecast wind drift. No margin existed for navigation error. A single degree of deviation sustained over such distances would put the formation miles off course with insufficient fuel to search for the target. The pilot's survival equipment reflected the mission's desperate nature. Mae West life preservers in case of water landing, though survival chances in shark-infested waters remained minimal. Jungle survival kits containing water purification tablets, emergency rations, fishing line, and basic medical supplies for bailouts over Bougainville. Each pilot carried a Colt M1911A1 .45 caliber pistol with extra magazines, understanding that capture meant certain execution. Japanese treatment of downed American aviators had grown increasingly brutal as the war progressed. Intelligence reports from rescued prisoners described beheadings, medical experiments performed without anesthesia, confirmed cases of cannibalism. The pilots understood the arithmetic of their situation clearly. Running out of fuel over water meant almost certain death from exposure or sharks. Mechanical failure over Japanese territory meant something worse still. Lieutenant Colonel Luther Moore, the weather officer, reviewed meteorological data one final time. Surface winds from the southeast at 8 knots. Winds at 5,000 feet from the south at 15 knots. Winds at 10,000 feet from the southwest at 22 knots. Tropical weather patterns in the Solomon Islands were notoriously unpredictable. A storm system developing anywhere along the route could doom the mission. Even unexpected headwinds might leave the P-38s without sufficient fuel to return. The meteorologist estimated a 70% probability of favorable conditions, but everyone understood that Solomon Islands weather could change within minutes. Towering cumulonimbus clouds could develop from clear skies in less than an hour. Radio silence would be absolute until contact with the enemy. The P-38's CR-274N radio sets had been specially tuned to frequency 6,710 kilocycles, unlikely to be monitored by Japanese listening posts. But any transmission risked alerting enemy forces within range. Mitchell would navigate the entire formation using dead reckoning, compass, airspeed indicator, clock, and mental calculation. No radio beacons to confirm position. No landmarks visible across the endless Pacific swells except occasional islands that had to be avoided. One man's navigation skills would determine whether 18 aircraft found their target or disappeared into the vast ocean. Lieutenant Julius Jack Jacobson checked his aircraft's weapons one final time. The 4 Browning A&M 250 caliber machine guns each carried 500 rounds of ammunition loaded in linked belts, M2 ball, M1 incendiary, and M2 armor-piercing rounds. Rate of fire reached 750 to 850 rounds per minute per gun. The 20mm Hispano M2 cannon carried 150 rounds of high-explosive and armor-piercing shells. The concentrated firepower clustered in the P-38's nose created a convergent zone of pure destruction capable of cutting through a bomber's wing spar in seconds. But ammunition consumption at maximum rate meant less than 37 seconds of firing time for the machine guns and less than 12 seconds for the cannon. Every burst would have to count. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 18th, ground crews performed final preparations under the watchful supervision of their crew chiefs. Master Sergeant Leo B. Godfrey supervised the arming crews, ensuring every round was properly seated and every ammunition belt correctly aligned. Fuel tanks were topped off to absolute capacity with 100-octane aviation gasoline. Internal tanks filled to 360 gallons. Drop tanks verified at 160 gallons each. Ammunition belts loaded with the prescribed mixture, ball, armor-piercing, and incendiary rounds in a 4:1:1 ratio. Drop tank attachments were checked and rechecked. A mechanical failure in a single shackle could abort an aircraft's participation, or worse, cause a tank to hang up and create fatal drag. Oil levels were verified, hydraulic pressures checked, control surfaces inspected for full range of motion. The Japanese Navy's 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul operated under strict protocols for high-ranking officer transport. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commander of the Southeast Area Fleet and Yamamoto's subordinate, had argued strongly against the inspection tour. American fighter activity had increased dramatically around Bougainville, following the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal in February. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans had nearly 200 fighters operating from Guadalcanal, the Russell Islands, and other forward bases. But Yamamoto insisted on personally congratulating the pilots of Operation IGO, the recent Japanese air offensive that had claimed dramatically inflated victories against American shipping. The initial reports painted a far grimmer picture than reality. Word came through of 1 cruiser sunk, 2 destroyers lost, and 25 transports destroyed. When the actual accounting was done, the numbers told a different story entirely. 1 destroyer, 1 corvette, 1 tanker, and 2 cargo vessels had actually gone down. The gap between perception and fact would matter far less than what happened next. Chief Petty Officer Hiroshi Hayashi stood at Lakanai Airfield overseeing the final preparations of Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft. Every detail had to be perfect. The Betty bomber, tail number 323 from the 705th Air Group, had been specifically chosen for its spotless maintenance history and engines that could be relied upon. This machine had completed 47 combat missions without serious mechanical trouble. Additional fuel tanks had been fitted inside the bomb bay to stretch the flying range. The Admiral's seat was positioned on the left side, just behind the pilot, offering an excellent vantage point for observing the landscape below. A specially designed rack had been mounted to secure Yamamoto's personal katana sword, a family treasure passed down since the 16th century Momoyama period. The fighter escort came from the 204th Air Group, a unit tested and proven through countless engagements across the Solomon Islands. 6 pilots had been selected for the duty, each averaging more than 500 hours of combat flying. Among them was Petty Officer Shoichi Sugita, who would eventually tally over 70 confirmed kills before falling in April 1945. Also assigned to escort was Petty Officer Kenji Yanagiya, a seasoned veteran with 100 missions under his belt. Yanagiya felt honored to have been chosen to shield the combined fleet commander. These men had tangled with American P-38s, P-39s, P-40s, and F-4F Wildcats in countless fierce encounters. They understood their enemy's strengths and their own. The Lightning possessed a speed advantage at high altitude, but that advantage evaporated below 15,000 feet. At lower altitudes, the Zero's superior power-to-weight ratio gave it the edge. The American fighters' turning radius at low altitude exceeded the Zero's by nearly double. In a dogfight near the treetops, Zero pilots believed they held every advantage except raw firepower and armor plating. At 07:25 hours local time, 0525 in Tokyo, on April 18th, Mitchell's P-38s began rolling down the runway at Fighter Strip No. 2 at Henderson Field. The takeoff sequence had been choreographed with precision to save time and conserve fuel. Mitchell led first, his flight of 3 following in formation. Then came Lanfear's killer flight, then the 2 cover flights in sequence. Lieutenant McClenahan's aircraft blew a tire during the takeoff roll. The P-38 skidded sideways in a billowing cloud of coral dust, tearing away the right wheel. Though unhurt, he was out. Lieutenant Joe Moore experienced a fuel pump failure as he climbed. He couldn't reach his drop tank reserves and had to turn back immediately. 16 P-38s continued onward, 2 fewer than anticipated. The already razor-thin margin for error had grown thinner still. Mitchell led the formation across the water at precisely 30 to 50 feet above the surface, beneath the radar net's ability to detect them. Salt spray peppered the windscreens almost immediately, forcing constant wiping and clearing. Radio silence was absolute. The pilots maintained formation through visual reference alone, each man locked in his own private struggle against boredom and exhaustion. 2 hours and 5 minutes of extreme low-altitude flying demanded constant throttle adjustment to hold position. Engine instruments received continuous attention while the pilots battled the sensation of detachment from reality. The Pacific swells rolled beneath them in hypnotic repetition, mile after mile after mile. Several pilots later admitted to fighting drowsiness, employing whatever tactics kept them awake. Slapping their own faces, singing at the top of their lungs, anything to maintain consciousness. The sun turned the cockpits into furnaces, despite the wind rushing past. Lieutenant Roger Ames, flying in the cover flight, grew increasingly concerned watching his fuel gauge. His drop tanks created more drag than the calculations had predicted. At his current burn rate, he would have perhaps 5 minutes of reserve fuel at best. The equation was straightforward and terrifying. Burn fuel faster on the way out, and they wouldn't survive the return. Conserve too much, and they might lack the power for combat when it came. Every pilot made constant micro-adjustments to propeller pitch and throttle, balancing the mission against their own survival. The Allison engines droned steadily, their synchronized rhythm becoming almost meditative across the endless hours. At 0600 hours, Tokyo time, 0800 local, Yamamoto's 2-bomber formation departed Rabaul exactly on schedule. The Admiral wore his dress whites with full decorations, including the Order of the Chrysanthemum and the Order of the Golden Kite, intending to impress the troops in the forward areas with Imperial Navy prestige. His demeanor that morning seemed unusually somber. Several staff officers would later testify that the Admiral appeared to sense something ominous about the flight. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff and close friend, occupied the second Betty with additional staff officers. The formation climbed to 6,500 feet, the escort Zeros positioning themselves in 2 3-plane flights. Visibility was excellent, with scattered cumulus clouds between 4,000 and 5,000 feet, offering occasional cover. Warrant Officer Kenji Yanagiya, flying escort in Zero Tail number 3081, scanned the sky in the prescribed patterns ingrained through years of training. 3 years of combat had sharpened his instincts to an almost supernatural level. He could identify aircraft types at distances where others saw only specks. His peripheral vision caught the slightest movement against cloud backgrounds. Yet this morning his focus remained on maintaining exact formation position. The route from Rabaul to Balal had been flown dozens of times without incident. American fighters had never penetrated this far north in strength. The real danger seemed to come from accidents rather than enemy action. At 09:34 hours local time, Mitchell's formation reached the final navigation checkpoint exactly on schedule. 2 hours and 9 minutes airborne over trackless ocean, guided only by dead reckoning. Mitchell checked his specially synchronized watch against his calculated position. If his navigation proved accurate, they should turn northwest now. If he had miscalculated wind or compass heading, they would miss their target completely. He waggled his wings, signaling the turn, and 16 P-38s banked in unison. The precision was extraordinary. They had navigated 410 miles across open ocean, using only compass, clock, and airspeed indicator, arriving 1 minute ahead of the planned intercept time. Lieutenant Douglas Canning, flying as Mitchell's wingman, spotted the target first. "Bougain's 11 o'clock high," he called, breaking radio silence for the first time. 5 miles away, altitude differential 6,000 feet, 8 aircraft in perfect formation, exactly where they were supposed to be. Mitchell felt adrenaline surge through him, mixed with amazement. They had found the needle in the Pacific haystack. 2 Betty bombers in echelon formation and 6 Zero fighters in 2 flights of 3, completely unaware of the 16 P-38s climbing toward them from below and behind. Mitchell issued the order immediately. Drop tanks, all flights. 16 65-gallon tanks tumbled toward the ocean as the P-38s shed their drag. Engines roared at war emergency power, delivering 1,475 horsepower each. The Lightnings accelerated through 300 miles per hour, climbing at 2,800 feet per minute. The killer flight would execute the attack, while Mitchell led the cover flight higher to intercept any fighters launching from Kahili. Captain Lanphier saw the escort Zeros react. They had spotted the approaching P-38s and were dropping their belly tanks, peeling off to engage. Lanphier made an instant tactical decision that would generate decades of controversy afterward. Instead of continuing toward the bombers with Barber, he turned to engage the diving Zeros head-on. His reasoning, as he would later claim, was to eliminate the escort threat and allow Barber a clear attack run. Critics would argue he was glory hunting, seeking easier fighter victories over the primary target. Lieutenant Barber maintained his course toward the bombers, now diving desperately toward the jungle canopy. The lead Betty nosed over into a steep dive, the pilot attempting to reach treetop level where the P-38's speed advantage would diminish and jungle would provide concealment. Barber pushed his Lightning into a 45-degree dive, airspeed climbing past 400 miles per hour. The distance closed rapidly, 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000. At 500 yards, Barber opened fire with all weapons. 4 streams of 50-caliber bullets and 20mm cannon shells converged on the bomber's right engine and wing root. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Betty's right engine erupted in orange flame, the wing severed by concentrated fire. The bomber rolled violently left, completely out of control. Barber pulled up hard to avoid collision, his P-38 groaning under the G-forces. He glimpsed the Betty's fuselage disappearing into the jungle canopy, trailing fire and debris. A black column of smoke marked where it struck. 1 bomber down, but Barber couldn't know which one carried Yamamoto. He searched for the second bomber. Holmes and Hine had followed Barber initially, but became separated in the violent maneuvering. Holmes spotted the second Betty, low over the water, racing south along the Bougainville coastline at maximum speed. Vice Admiral Ugaki's pilot had chosen a different escape route, diving for the ocean rather than the jungle, hoping the water's surface would prevent attacks from below. Holmes rolled into attack position, but his closure rate was too fast. He fired a long burst that damaged the Betty's right engine, producing a white vapor trail of leaking fuel and oil, but overshot before achieving decisive damage. Barber acquired the second bomber after Holmes passed. The Betty was barely 50 feet above the waves, its damaged engine trailing smoke. Barber lined up for a deflection shot, leading the target by 30 degrees to account for its speed. His first burst walked across the water, sending up geysers of spray, then climbed into the bomber's fuselage. Large pieces of metal skin peeled away, some striking Barber's P-38 with audible impacts. The Betty's left engine caught fire. The pilot attempted a controlled water landing, but hit the ocean at over 100 miles per hour. The aircraft broke apart on impact, fuselage separating from wings. Meanwhile, Lanphier engaged the escort Zeros in a violent vertical scissors maneuver. His P-38's superior speed allowed him to maintain energy, while the lighter Zeros relied on turning ability. Lanphier claimed to have shot down one Zero during this engagement, describing how he rolled inverted and fired into its wing roots, causing it to explode. Japanese records showed no escort fighters were lost. The remaining Zeros, led by Warrant Officer Yanagiya, focused on driving off the American fighters rather than pursuing decisive engagement. Their primary mission, protecting the bombers, had already failed catastrophically. The top cover flight led by Mitchell watched for fighters from Kahili Airfield, only 20 miles away. The expected swarm of 75 Zeros never appeared. Either surprise was complete, or Japanese fighters were committed elsewhere. Mitchell maintained altitude advantage at 18,000 feet, ready to dive on any climbing interceptors. Below him, the killer flight completed their attacks and turned for home. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, perhaps 3 minutes of actual combat. The mission's success would depend on which bomber had carried Yamamoto. Lieutenant Barber's P-38 had sustained significant damage during the engagement. His aircraft bore 104 bullet holes from return fire by the bomber's Type 92 defensive machine guns and possibly from Zero fighters. Hydraulic fluid leaked from punctured lines, leaving reddish streaks along the fuselage. One engine ran rough, possibly from debris ingestion or battle damage. But both Allison engines continued functioning and the Lightning remained controllable. Barber began the long flight home, constantly monitoring engine temperatures and fuel consumption. Every unusual vibration might signal impending engine failure over 400 miles of hostile ocean. The return flight tested every pilot's endurance and skill. Fuel reserves were critically low for several aircraft. Lieutenant Holmes experienced engine problems that forced him to reduce power, falling behind the formation. Radio discipline was partially maintained, despite temptation to coordinate or call for help. Each pilot was alone with his calculations, estimating whether remaining fuel would carry him home. The mathematics of survival played out simultaneously in 16 cockpits. As they approached the Russell Islands, approximately 200 miles from home, several pilots faced critical decisions. Lieutenant Heinz's fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels. Rather than risk ditching at sea, he could attempt landing at the emergency strip on Banneker Island. But Japanese submarines had been reported in the area, and rescue was uncertain. He chose to continue, trusting his calculations and the Allison engines. Mitchell's navigation on the return leg proved equally precise. The scattered P-38s gradually reformed as they approached Guadalcanal. At 12:30 hours local time, Fighter Strip 2 appeared ahead exactly where expected. Several aircraft operated on fumes. Holmes landed with both engines sputtering, fuel tanks essentially dry. Others landed with less than 10 gallons remaining, perhaps 3 minutes of flight time. The margin between triumph and disaster had been measured in gallons of gasoline. As the pilots shut down their engines, ground crews swarmed the aircraft, counting bullet holes and assessing damage. The immediate question consumed everyone's mind. Had they succeeded? Which bomber carried Yamamoto? The pilots could only report 2 bombers destroyed, but target identification had been impossible during the fierce combat. Intelligence officers would have to wait for Japanese reaction to determine the mission's true outcome. The wait would prove agonizing. That evening, as tropical darkness fell over Guadalcanal, the pilots gathered in the officers' club, a ramshackle structure of salvaged lumber and captured Japanese materials. Captain Lanphier, ever conscious of publicity, immediately began promoting his version of events. He claimed to have shot down Yamamoto's bomber after a spectacular vertical reversal maneuver, rolling inverted and firing into the bomber from above. His account would have required him to be in 2 places simultaneously, engaging Zeros while also attacking bombers. Lieutenant Barber quietly disputed this version, describing his straightforward stern attack on the lead bomber. Japanese search parties found Admiral Yamamoto's crashed bomber the following day, April 19th. The wreckage lay scattered through dense jungle approximately 4 miles inland from Moila Point, near the village of Aku on Bougainville. The search was led by Lieutenant Commander Tabuchi Shigeru of the 26th Air Flotilla. Yamamoto's body was discovered thrown clear of the main wreckage, but still strapped in his aircraft seat. He maintained a dignified posture even in death, his white-gloved hand still clutching his ceremonial sword. Medical examination by Dr. Tanaka revealed 2 gunshot wounds. One bullet had entered below his left shoulder blade, exiting above his right eye. Another had struck his jaw. Death had been instantaneous, probably during Barber's initial firing pass. The psychological impact on the Japanese Navy was devastating beyond calculation. Yamamoto was not merely a fleet commander, but the embodiment of Japanese naval tradition and strategic thinking. His understanding of combined fleet operations was unmatched. His ability to inspire loyalty amongst subordinates was legendary. His realistic assessment of American capabilities had provided the only check on Japanese strategic overreach. Captain Yasugi Watanabe, one of Yamamoto's staff officers who survived the second bomber's crash with severe injuries, later described the admiral's death as the void that could never be filled. Watanabe had been playing shogi with Yamamoto just the night before, and the admiral had seemed unusually fatalistic. Japanese naval intelligence immediately suspected the Americans had broken their codes. The sheer precision of that intercept seemed almost beyond belief. After traveling 600 miles, the American fighters arrived at the exact moment and location where Yamamoto's bombers would appear. The timing couldn't have been coincidence, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. Yet acknowledging that Japanese codes had been broken would force Tokyo's military leadership to admit a catastrophic intelligence failure that threatened everything still in motion. Instead, Japanese officials maintained the story that Yamamoto had perished while overseeing combat operations, preserving the fiction that enemy action had claimed him during routine warfare rather than what had actually occurred. A deliberately planned assassination. America's response remained measured and cautious. American leaders understood the danger. If Japanese officials confirmed that their codes were compromised, the tremendous intelligence advantage that had proved so decisive at Midway and made the Yamamoto mission possible would evaporate. President Roosevelt learned the news with grim satisfaction, but immediately imposed complete secrecy. Admiral Nimitz felt genuine concern that public disclosure might expose American code-breaking achievements. For more than a month, ordinary Americans had no idea that Yamamoto was dead. They certainly didn't know that American fighter pilots had shot him down. But almost immediately upon landing, the pilots began arguing about who deserved credit for the kill, a dispute that would damage friendships for decades to come. Captain Lanphier seized upon the opportunity for recognition. His story evolved and expanded with each retelling. He claimed to have executed a dramatic vertical flip, rolling completely inverted to fire directly into the bomber's wing root from above. This supposed maneuver would have required Lanphier to somehow occupy 2 places simultaneously while performing movements that simply exceeded what a P-38 could physically accomplish. Lieutenant Barber's version remained straightforward and never wavered. He described a basic stern chase where he attacked the lead bomber from behind, then pursued and struck the second bomber. After the war, Japanese witnesses, including Zero pilot Yanagaya, corroborated Barber's account. They confirmed seeing just one P-38 approach the lead bomber from behind and below, precisely as Barber had described. The bullet wounds on Yamamoto's body told their own story. Projectiles had entered from below and behind, matching Barber's attack angle perfectly. The pattern of bullet holes scattered through the wreckage also indicated fire coming from behind and below, not from above. This technical evidence supported one version of events, but the argument persisted among those involved for many years. Time magazine featured the mission in October 1943, actually naming Lanphier in print. A reckless breach that nearly compromised the entire operation. Not until 1991 did the Air Force officially recognize both men, awarding each pilot half credit for one kill. a diplomatic solution that left everyone frustrated. Then, in 2003, after historians examined Japanese records thoroughly, reviewed crash site evidence carefully, and listened to witness testimony, they concluded that Barber alone had shot down Yamamoto. Major Mitchell, the mission commander, whose navigation abilities had been nothing short of extraordinary, received the Navy Cross rather than the Medal of Honor that had originally been recommended. The security leak caused by premature publicity had angered Navy brass considerably. Every pilot who flew that day received the Navy Cross, acknowledging both the operation's exceptional difficulty and its profound significance. Yet Mitchell's achievements deserved recognition beyond what military politics allowed. Finding a moving target across 600 miles using dead reckoning alone represented remarkable navigation. The technical innovations tested during Operation Vengeance would shape American fighter development throughout the war. The P-38 had demonstrated a unique combination of range, firepower, and speed that proved absolutely essential. No other American fighter possessed the capability to execute this mission. The twin engines provided reliability that kept damaged aircraft flyable when single-engine fighters would have gone down. The concentrated nose-mounted weapons created devastating effects instantly, something wing-mounted guns could never achieve. These discoveries would guide the development of long-range escort fighters, including the P-51D Mustang. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from losing Yamamoto. His successor, Admiral Minoichi Koga, possessed neither Yamamoto's strategic thinking nor his ability to inspire loyalty and confidence. Koga himself died in a plane crash less than a year later, in March 1944, another devastating blow to Japan's naval officer corps. Japanese naval operations became increasingly erratic and desperate, rather than following any coherent plan. The massive naval engagement Yamamoto had hoped to arrange, one decisive battle to destroy American carrier forces, never took shape. Instead, Japanese naval aviation gradually disappeared through attrition at the Marianas and subsequent battles in the Philippine Sea. The impact went beyond military calculations. Japanese propaganda had painted Yamamoto as invincible, the supreme strategic mind who would lead Japan toward certain triumph. His death exploded this carefully constructed mythology. If Yamamoto could be hunted down and eliminated, what hope remained for Japan? Confidence within the Japanese military began deteriorating, and each subsequent defeat accelerated the decline. American code-breaking continued to deliver decisive advantages throughout the Pacific Campaign. The Japanese never fully grasped that their codes had been compromised, implementing only minor changes rather than completely overhauling their systems. This intelligence blindness proved terribly expensive at the Philippine Sea, where American pilots destroyed Japanese naval aviation in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Reading enemy intentions transformed American defense into precision traps and carefully staged ambushes. The human cost extended to those who had flown for Operation Vengeance. Lieutenant Raymond Hine was subsequently lost to enemy action, never returning from a later mission. Captain Lanphier left military service after the war to pursue political and business opportunities, continuing to promote his version of the kill despite its disputed accuracy. Lieutenant Barber remained in the Air Force, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1961. His quiet nature kept him from aggressively challenging Lanphier's narrative until late in life, when historical evidence finally vindicated his account. The mission's success had required extraordinary teamwork between intelligence agencies, naval command, and Army aviation. Cryptanalysts like Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton had decrypted the message. Marine Major John Condon had helped plan the operation. Army Air Force pilots had conducted the intercept. This inter-service collaboration, unusual in other Pacific operations, proved that unified command could accomplish remarkable things. These lessons shaped American military doctrine through the rest of World War II and beyond. Yamamoto's death represented more than losing a single commander. His clear understanding of American capabilities had given Japan its only realistic strategic perspective. Among all Japanese leaders, only Yamamoto truly comprehended American industrial strength and national determination. His famous words captured this wisdom. I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that I have no confidence. He understood that Japan couldn't win a prolonged conflict. His replacement by leaders who believed spiritual power could overcome material disadvantage hastened Japan's destruction. The date itself mattered, April 18, 1943. Exactly 12 months after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, American fighters had struck at Japan's military leadership. The timing held deliberate and powerful symbolism. America could extend its reach across vast distances to strike specific targets with deadly precision. No Japanese officer could feel completely safe. The hunted had become the hunters. Anxiety rippled through Japanese military leadership, breeding hesitation and doubt in strategic decisions. Technical investigation of the mission revealed both capabilities and constraints in American air operations. The P-38s had operated at the absolute limit of their range. Several aircraft limped back with fuel gauges approaching empty. Had Yamamoto's flight been delayed by just 30 minutes, the American fighters might have exhausted their fuel before finding the target. Success and failure had been separated by fuel gallons and flight minutes, an impossibly narrow margin. This tight tolerance demonstrated the critical need for even longer-range fighters and superior fuel management techniques. Weather played a role that cannot be overstated. Visibility extended beyond 10 miles at the intercept point, allowing visual contact at maximum range. Broken cloud cover along the return flight path provided protection from Japanese interceptors searching from below. Had a tropical storm moved across their route, the mission would have been scrubbed. As pilots often observed, weather chose sides on April 18, 1943. Even a small wind shift could have spelled disaster. Japanese attempts to suppress news of Yamamoto's death demonstrated how catastrophic the loss actually was. For over a month, Japanese propaganda released statements allegedly from Yamamoto. Finally, on May 21, 1943, Tokyo announced his death, claiming he had fallen while directing combat operations. A state funeral on June 5 brought hundreds of thousands into Tokyo streets to mourn. Emperor Hirohito attended personally, an extraordinary honor that reflected Yamamoto's exceptional status within Japanese society. Part of his remains were buried at Tama Cemetery in Tokyo, the rest interred at his family temple in Nagaoka. The pilots who flew that mission carried conflicting emotions for years afterward. They had successfully eliminated a respected enemy, a man many recognized as a military genius. Yamamoto had opposed war with America, understanding its folly better than those who ordered him to plan Pearl Harbor. Yet he had orchestrated that attack, making him a legitimate target for retaliation. The moral weight of targeted assassination troubled several participants throughout their remaining lives. Intelligence officer Edwin Layton, who had advocated approving the mission, later reflected on Yamamoto's death with complex feelings. He had known Yamamoto personally from 1930s diplomatic gatherings. He grasped that Yamamoto's strategic vision, though dangerous to America, rested on realistic appraisal rather than military fantasy. Yet Layton also recognized that Yamamoto's death would protect American lives by disrupting Japanese naval operations. War demanded making such agonizing decisions. The operation had demonstrated American technological superiority in several dimensions. Code breaking supplied the intelligence. Long-range fighters provided the weapon. Exceptional navigation provided the delivery mechanism. Yet technology alone hadn't guaranteed results. Human abilities had mattered tremendously. Mitchell's navigation expertise, Barber's marksmanship, and the maintenance team's dedication had transformed technical possibility into actual success. Throughout the Pacific War, this combination of human skill and mechanical capability would define American military strength. Post-war researchers discovered how frequently the mission had approached failure. If Lieutenant Canning hadn't spotted the Japanese formation when he did, the P-38s might have flown past their target entirely. If Barber hadn't pursued the diving bomber, Yamamoto might have disappeared into the jungle alive. If Holmes hadn't damaged the second bomber, leaving Barber to finish the job, surviving witnesses might have revealed that American cryptographers had penetrated Japanese codes. Every component in this chain had held, but barely. Detailed squadron records revealed how narrow the margins had been. Fuel consumption calculations showed that several aircraft had exceeded predicted ranges, succeeding only through favorable winds and meticulous engine management. Ammunition logs indicated that Barber had expended roughly 70% of his ammunition supply across his 2 attack runs. Maintenance records documented substantial damage to multiple fighters, showing the ferocity of Japanese defensive fire during those brief moments of combat. Yamamoto's death carried profound strategic implications beyond immediate military consequences. His absence removed the sole Japanese leader who might have negotiated acceptable peace terms as circumstances turned against Japan. Yamamoto recognized that prolonged war against American industrial capacity meant defeat. His successors lacked his strategic insight and couldn't wield comparable influence, embracing increasingly reckless tactics that extended the conflict and cost countless lives on both sides. The kamikaze operations that emerged later reflected the strategic desperation that followed Yamamoto's elimination. Weather records for April 18, 1943 confirmed that conditions had been exceptionally favorable for mission success. Visibility stretched beyond 10 miles across most of the route. Cloud cover remained broken rather than complete. Wind speeds and directions matched forecast expectations closely. In the Solomon Islands' typical weather patterns, such favorable conditions appeared perhaps once every 10 days. The mission had launched during a narrow opening that might not have reappeared for weeks. The intelligence breakthrough enabling Operation Vengeance represented the work of hundreds of crypt analysts, translators, and specialists, laboring in absolute secrecy at Station Hypo and related facilities. Their contributions to eventual victory often remained unrecognized, overshadowed by more visible combat achievements. Without their patient, meticulous work, the Yamamoto mission would have been impossible. The code breakers had forged the sword. The pilots had simply wielded it. Forensic examination of the destroyed Betty bomber revealed how devastatingly effective concentrated forward-firing armament proved. The P-38's machine guns and 20mm cannon created a focused destruction zone approximately 30 inches across at normal combat distances. Nothing within this zone could survive intact. The bomber's aluminum structure had been shredded, control systems severed, fuel systems ruptured, and crew killed instantly. No armor thickness could have withstood such intense concentrated fire. The Zero escort's failure to defend the bombers exposed a significant flaw in Japanese tactical doctrine. The fighters had reacted according to established procedures, engaging the attacking aircraft rather than staying close to shield the bombers. This predictable response had permitted Barber to reach the bombers, while Lanphier kept the fighters occupied. American pilots would repeatedly exploit this tactical rigidity in future engagements. Nimitz's authorization of the mission had involved difficult calculation of potential risks and possible benefits. If operations had failed with substantial losses, it might have exposed American code breaking without achieving anything. If news had leaked prematurely, the Japanese might have completely revised their codes. Nimitz had accepted these dangers because Yamamoto represented an irreplaceable target, a commander whose particular talents couldn't be duplicated. History confirmed that his gamble had paid off. The mission planning demonstrated American superiority in staff coordination and operational organization. Planners had considered multiple approaches and rejected most options. Backup plans addressed various failure scenarios. Weather patterns had received detailed analysis. Fuel consumption had been projected with extreme precision. This comprehensive methodology, blending meticulous preparation with tactical adaptability, would characterize successful American operations throughout the remaining Pacific campaign. Operation Vengeance reflected American feelings about Pearl Harbor, yet the pilots involved reported experiencing little personal desire for vengeance. They had performed a military assignment with professional composure. The larger satisfaction of remembering Pearl Harbor belonged to strategy makers and political figures. For the pilots, returning alive and accomplishing the assignment represented sufficient success. The operation showed how American fighter tactics had evolved from defensive to offensive roles. Earlier in the war, American fighters had worked desperately to protect their own bombers from Japanese attacks. By April 1943, American fighters were executing sophisticated offensive missions deep into enemy-held territory. This transformation reflected superior aircraft designs, improved training standards, better tactical concepts, and growing confidence born from repeated success. The Operation Vengeance legacy extends beyond its immediate military consequences. It demonstrated that individual leadership still mattered even in mechanized modern warfare, that carefully gathered intelligence could enable precise military strikes, that technology without human expertise and skill meant nothing. These principles would resonate through future American military interventions from Vietnam through contemporary conflicts. Ultimately, Operation Vengeance represented American warfare at its finest. Advanced technology, guided by accurate intelligence, thorough planning executed with tactical flexibility, and individual excellence functioning within coordinated team structure. These elements had combined to kill Admiral Yamamoto, eliminating Japan's most realistic hope for negotiated settlement. The Pacific conflict would persist for another 28 months, but the war's eventual outcome had become certain. April 18, 1943, commenced with 18 American pilots preparing for what seemed impossible. It concluded with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, lifeless in the Bougainville jungle, Japan's naval strategy in ruins, and American triumph across the Pacific increasingly inescapable. The longest fighter intercept mission ever flown had succeeded through brilliant organization, superior equipment, exceptional flying abilities, and extraordinary fortune. Operation Vengeance had delivered precisely what its name promised: revenge for Pearl Harbor and the removal of Japan's most formidable military strategist. The 16 P-38 Lightnings that returned to Guadalcanal that afternoon had fundamentally altered the Pacific War's trajectory. Their pilots had flown to the extreme limits of machine capability and human endurance, fought a brief but decisive engagement, and came home. In those moments over Bougainville, they had accomplished what thousands of bombers and millions of rounds could not: the precise elimination of an irreplaceable adversary. Targeted assassination had entered the modern warfare playbook, and combat would never quite return to what it had been before.